In the autumn of 1867, 23 immigrant families set out from Omaha, Nebraska, heading west toward the promise of fertile land and new beginnings. Not a single one reached their destination. They all stopped at the same place, the Shepherd Family Aid Station. When the local sheriff began investigating the disappearances, he noticed something chilling. Meat sales in the small town had increased by 400% over the past 3 years, yet there wasn't a single pig farm operating within 50 miles. The raid conducted in October 1870 would uncover one of the most horrifying family crimes in American history. The Shepherds weren't just helping travelers, they were feeding on them. Before we descend into the darkness that consumed the Shepherd family and turned a house of God into a house of horror, I need you to do something. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the most disturbing truths hidden in America's past. If you're one of the few who can handle these dark revelations, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment telling me what state you're listening from, because these stories happened closer to your home than you might think. Your support helps us uncover the stories that history tried to bury forever. Now let's journey back to 1867, when the Nebraska frontier promised salvation but delivered damnation. The Nebraska Territory of 1867 was a land of impossible dreams and crushing realities. Following the Homestead Act of 1862, thousands of families poured westward, lured by the government's promise of 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to cultivate it for 5 years. The prairies stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of grass broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood trees marking creek beds, and the distant horizon where earth met sky. For the immigrants who had sold everything they owned in Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia for passage to America, this vast wilderness represented both terrifying emptiness and boundless opportunity. The journey westward from Omaha was treacherous under the best circumstances. Families traveled in wagon trains, their entire worldly possessions packed into canvas-covered vehicles pulled by exhausted oxen. The route took them through nearly 200 miles of open prairie where water sources were scarce, hostile weather could strike without warning, and the threat of starvation haunted every mile. By the time most wagon trains reached the halfway point of their journey, supplies were running dangerously low, animals were weakening, and the most vulnerable members, the elderly, the sick, and small children, were beginning to succumb to the harsh realities of frontier travel. It was precisely at this point of maximum vulnerability, roughly 90 miles west of Omaha, along the Platte River Trail, that travelers encountered the Shepherd Family Aid Station. The property sat on a slight rise overlooking the river, a substantial 2-story wooden structure that seemed to materialize from the prairie like an oasis in a desert. A large sign painted in neat letters proclaimed Shepherd's Rest Christian Aid Station, all travelers welcome, no charge. For exhausted, desperate families who had been traveling for weeks through hostile wilderness, the sight of that welcoming structure represented divine providence. Reverend Thomas Shepherd had established the aid station in the spring of 1864, just 2 years after the Homestead Act opened Nebraska to settlement. He arrived with his wife Martha, 5 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, and a wagon loaded with supplies and building materials. Shepherd presented himself to the sparse local community as a Methodist minister called by God to serve travelers making the perilous journey westward. He carried impeccable credentials, including letters of reference from churches in Pennsylvania and Ohio, a well-worn Bible with his name inscribed in gold leaf, and the bearing of a man accustomed to spiritual leadership. The local community, consisting of barely 200 souls scattered across the prairie in isolated homesteads, welcomed the Shepherd family with genuine gratitude. The nearest established town was more than 40 miles away, and the presence of a minister represented not just spiritual guidance, but also social legitimacy for the struggling settlement. Shepherd conducted Sunday services in a makeshift chapel, performed marriages and baptisms, and offered counsel to families struggling with the brutal realities of frontier life. Within months, he had established himself as a pillar of the small community, a man whose presence elevated their rough settlement from mere survival camp to civilized society. The aid station itself seemed to embody Christian charity in its purest form. Shepherd had constructed a large building specifically designed to accommodate traveling families, with separate sleeping quarters for men and women, a communal dining area, and a well-stocked pantry. He made it clear that his services were provided without charge, supported entirely by his own resources and occasional donations from grateful travelers. For families arriving exhausted and desperate after weeks of brutal travel, the aid station represented a miraculous respite, a place where they could rest, recover their strength, eat proper meals, and prepare for the final leg of their journey. But the Shepherd family's operation was far more calculated and sinister than it appeared. Thomas Shepherd was indeed a minister, trained in seminary and ordained by a legitimate Methodist congregation. But somewhere during his years of wandering between small churches in Pennsylvania and Ohio, something had broken inside him. Perhaps it was the poverty he witnessed, perhaps the hypocrisy he saw among wealthy congregation members, or perhaps something darker that had always lurked beneath his pious exterior. By the time he reached Nebraska, Thomas Shepherd had developed a twisted theology that would have horrified any legitimate Christian scholar. Shepherd believed that he had received a special revelation from God, a divine mandate to judge travelers and determine their worthiness to continue westward. In his diseased mind, the American frontier represented a new Eden, and he had been appointed as its guardian angel, charged with ensuring that only the righteous would inherit the promised land. Those he deemed unworthy, the greedy, the proud, the wasteful, or simply those who possessed resources he coveted, were not just criminals against God, but obstacles to be removed. And in removing them, Shepherd convinced himself that he was not committing murder, but performing holy execution. Martha Shepherd, his wife of 20 years, had long since surrendered any independent moral judgment to her husband's authority. Raised in a strict religious household where women's submission to male leadership was considered divine law, she had been conditioned to accept her husband's pronouncements as if they came directly from God. When Thomas first revealed his mission to her in 1864, Martha experienced brief moments of doubt and horror. But Thomas was a master manipulator who knew exactly how to exploit his wife's religious conditioning. He framed his crimes not as murder, but as righteous judgment, not as theft, but as redistribution of resources from the unworthy to the godly. Within months, Martha had become not just an accomplice, but an enthusiastic participant in her husband's twisted crusade. The Shepherd children presented a more complex psychological picture. The oldest 16-year-old Thomas Jr. absorbed his father's teachings with the fervor of a young man seeking purpose and identity. The middle children, 14-year-old Rebecca, 12-year-old Samuel, and 10-year-old Martha Jr., were young enough to be molded by their parents' influence, but old enough to understand the reality of what was happening. Only the youngest, 6-year-old Lucy, seemed to retain some capacity for independent moral judgment, though she was far too young and terrified to articulate her growing horror at her family's activities. The family's methodology was brutally efficient and refined through 3 years of practice. When wagon trains or individual families arrived at the aid station, Thomas would engage them in lengthy conversations, assessing their resources, character, and whether they would be missed. Families traveling alone without connections to larger wagon trains were preferred targets. Immigrants who spoke limited English and had few contacts in America were ideal victims. Those who displayed wealth through quality goods or livestock but lacked the means to defend themselves became marked for death. The actual killing process began with hospitality that seemed genuine. The Shepherd family would welcome travelers with warm meals, comfortable sleeping arrangements, and lengthy evening prayers that reinforced the perception of a godly household. Martha's cooking was genuinely excellent, a crucial element in disarming suspicion. The meals were hearty and flavorful, exactly what exhausted travelers desperately craved. But the final course, usually coffee or cider, contained a carefully measured dose of laudanum, a legal opiate widely available on the frontier for pain relief and medicinal purposes. The drugged travelers would gradually become drowsy and disoriented, their symptoms appearing identical to simple exhaustion after weeks of brutal travel. The Shepherds would suggest that guests retire early to recover their strength, guiding them to sleeping quarters that had been specifically designed for what came next. The rooms contained beds with heavy wooden frames bolted to the floor, positioned to provide optimal angles for what the family referred to as processing. Windows were small and positioned high on walls, making escape difficult even for someone fully alert and capable. Once the victims were unconscious, the family would move with the efficiency of a practiced assembly line. Thomas Jr. and Samuel would secure the victims with ropes, while Thomas Sr. would perform what he called God's judgment, a quick death by throat cutting that minimized struggle and preserved the maximum amount of usable material. Rebecca and Martha Jr. would prepare the processing area in the basement, a space that had been carefully designed and equipped for butchering on an industrial scale. The basement of the aid station was where the true horror of the Shepherd operation became apparent. Thomas had designed and built the space specifically for processing human bodies, incorporating features that demonstrated disturbing premeditation and engineering skill. The floor was constructed with a slight slope toward a central drainage channel that carried blood and waste fluids away from the work area. Heavy iron hooks hung from reinforced ceiling beams, positioned at heights and intervals that allowed for efficient hanging and processing of bodies. A large brick furnace occupied one corner, used both for heating water and for reducing bones and other waste materials to ash that could be safely disposed of. Work tables constructed from thick wooden planks were positioned around the room, their surfaces scarred and stained from 3 years of use. An impressive collection of butchering tools hung on the walls, everything from fine surgical scalpels to heavy cleavers and bone saws. Thomas had even constructed a specialized device for rendering fat, a large iron pot positioned over a brick furnace that could maintain precise temperatures for hours. The entire space was organized with the methodical efficiency of a professional slaughterhouse, which in essence is exactly what it was. The processing itself followed a systematic procedure that Martha had refined over years of experimentation. Bodies were first bled completely, the blood collected in large barrels for later disposal or use as fertilizer. The initial butchering separated major muscle groups and organs with careful attention to preserving cuts that could pass as pork when properly prepared. Martha had developed techniques for curing and smoking meat that made it virtually indistinguishable from legitimate pork products. She used salt, sugar, and various spices in precise combinations that masked any unusual flavors while producing products that local residents and passing travelers eagerly purchased. The Shepherd's special pork became renowned throughout the region for its quality and flavor. Local homesteaders struggling to produce sufficient meat for their families purchased Shepherd products regularly. Wagon trains passing through would stock up on preserved meats for the remainder of their journey. The irony that many travelers were literally consuming the remains of previous travelers who had stopped at the aid station would not be discovered until the final raid in 1870. The financial profits from meat sales combined with the money and valuables stolen from victims provided the Shepherd family with a standard of living far above what a frontier minister could normally expect. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Shepherd operation was not the physical brutality, but the psychological manipulation that allowed it to continue for years without detection. Thomas maintained his role as respected community minister, conducting regular Sunday services where he preached about Christian charity, the importance of helping travelers, and the divine mandate to build godly communities on the frontier. He served as counselor and spiritual advisor to local families, offering prayers for sick children and guidance for families struggling with poverty and isolation. His public persona was so convincing that when concerns about missing travelers did eventually arise, virtually no one in the local community suspected that the pious Reverend Shepherd could be involved. The family also maintained careful records of their victims, though not for purposes of guilt or remorse. Thomas kept a leather-bound journal that documented each family or individual who passed through the aid station, including detailed descriptions of their possessions, the dates of their arrival and departure, and notes about the quality and quantity of material harvested from each victim. This meticulous record-keeping, intended to help the family track their profits and avoid dangerous patterns, would ultimately become the most damning evidence against them when authorities finally raided the property. By the autumn of 1867, the Shepherd operation had been running smoothly for over 3 years. They had processed more than 40 families, totaling approximately 156 individuals, without arousing serious suspicion from local authorities. The family's wealth had grown substantially, though they were careful to avoid displays that might prompt questions about the source of their prosperity. Thomas purchased additional land, expanded the aid station building, and continued to present himself as a humble servant of God, blessed with modest success through hard work and divine favor. But cracks were beginning to appear in the carefully constructed facade. Some travelers who had stopped at the aid station earlier in their journeys, but had not stayed overnight, began reporting to authorities in Western territories that families who had been traveling with them had disappeared after stopping at Shepherd's Rest. These reports were initially dismissed as the normal attrition of frontier travel, where families frequently changed plans, turned back, or perished from disease and accidents. However, the number of such reports was beginning to accumulate, and a pattern was emerging that some officials found troubling. More significantly, young Lucy Shepherd was experiencing increasing psychological trauma from witnessing her family's crimes. At just 9 years old in 1867, she had spent the past 3 years watching her parents and siblings murder dozens of people. Unlike her older siblings who had been successfully indoctrinated into their father's twisted theology, Lucy retained an instinctive sense that what her family was doing was profoundly wrong. She began experiencing nightmares that left her screaming in the night, episodes that her parents explained to concerned neighbors as the result of a nervous temperament. She became withdrawn and anxious, flinching at sudden movements and avoiding eye contact with strangers. Thomas Shepherd recognized that his youngest daughter represented a potential security threat to the operation. He attempted to address this through a combination of religious indoctrination and veiled threats, emphasizing that Lucy's salvation and her entire family's safety depended on her maintaining complete silence about their activities. He framed their crimes in biblical terms, comparing their work to the Old Testament stories of God commanding the Israelites to slaughter entire populations. He told Lucy that questioning God's commands was the sin that had caused Lucifer's fall from heaven, and that she must trust in her father's divine mission, even when she did not fully understand it. But despite Thomas's efforts, Lucy's psychological state continued to deteriorate. By late 1867, she had developed physical symptoms of extreme stress, including frequent stomach pains, difficulty eating, and episodes where she would become temporarily mute. Martha Shepherd, recognizing that Lucy's visible distress might eventually prompt uncomfortable questions from community members, began keeping the girl isolated at the aid station, claiming she was too delicate for regular social interaction. This isolation only intensified Lucy's trauma and reinforced her growing conviction that her family's activities were evil rather than divinely mandated. The autumn of 1867 brought an unusually large wave of immigrant families through the region, fleeing crop failures and political instability in Europe. For the Shepherd family, this represented unprecedented opportunity. In just 3 months between September and November, they processed 11 families totaling 47 individuals. This dramatic increase in their killing rate, driven by greed and the availability of vulnerable targets, would prove to be their fatal mistake. The sheer number of disappearances in such a short period finally exceeded the threshold that frontier authorities could dismiss as normal attrition. The winter of 1867 brought unusually harsh weather to the Nebraska prairie, with blizzards that buried homesteads under mountains of snow and temperatures that dropped so low that livestock froze standing in their fields. For Sheriff William McBride, stationed in the small town of Kearney, nearly 40 miles east of the Shepherd property, the brutal weather created a backlog of administrative work that included reviewing reports from Western territories about missing travelers. What he discovered in those reports would change everything. McBride was not a typical frontier lawman. At 52 years old, he had served as a detective with the Philadelphia police force for 15 years before moving west in 1863, seeking a quieter life after his wife's death. He brought with him investigative skills honed in one of America's largest cities, including a methodical approach to evidence gathering and a suspicious nature that served him well in detecting patterns that others might miss. As he sorted through the accumulated reports during the long winter evenings, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Between June 1864 and November 1867, at least 23 families or individual travelers had been reported missing by relatives, business partners, or fellow wagon train members in Western territories. The missing persons had all been traveling the same basic route westward from Omaha, and multiple witnesses placed them on the trail in the vicinity of the Platte River corridor, where the Shepherd aid station was located. More troubling still, several of the reports specifically mentioned that the missing families had expressed intention to stop at a Christian aid station that offered free accommodations to travelers. McBride began cross-referencing these reports with local records and quickly discovered additional anomalies. The Shepherd family had been purchasing unusually large quantities of salt, sugar, and smoking supplies from merchants in Kearney, far more than a family of 7 could reasonably use for personal consumption. When questioned, merchants reported that Reverend Shepherd explained these purchases as necessary for his aid station work, preserving food to feed the many travelers who stopped at his property. This explanation seemed reasonable on its surface, but McBride's trained instincts told him something was wrong. More damning still was the economic picture that emerged from careful investigation. The Shepherd family had arrived in Nebraska in 1864 with modest resources, yet within 3 years had accumulated substantial wealth. They had purchased additional land, made significant improvements to their property, and paid for everything in cash or with gold coins. When McBride discreetly inquired about Shepherd's income sources, the Reverend claimed that grateful travelers often made donations to support his aid station work, and that he occasionally sold preserved meats to supplement his income. But the amounts involved seemed far beyond what such activities could reasonably generate. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. In January 1868, a traveling salesman named Heinrich Muller arrived at the sheriff's office with a disturbing story. Muller had stopped at the Shepherd aid station in November 1867, arriving late in the evening during a snowstorm. The family had welcomed him warmly and offered him supper and a place to sleep. But Muller, who had been ill with dysentery for several days, declined the evening meal and immediately went to bed in the sleeping quarters provided for male travelers. During the night, Muller awoke feeling slightly better and decided to go outside to relieve himself. As he passed through the main house toward the back door, he heard sounds coming from the basement that struck him as odd. Heavy objects being moved, the sound of metal on metal, and voices speaking in urgent whispers. Curious and somewhat disoriented from illness, Muller opened the door leading to the basement stairs and descended a few steps. What he saw in the lamplight below froze his blood. The Shepherd family was gathered around a large wooden table, working with what appeared to be butchering tools on something Muller could not clearly see from his vantage point. But the smell that wafted up the stairs was unmistakable, the metallic scent of fresh blood mixed with something else that Muller, a man who had helped his father butcher many pigs in Germany, found disturbingly unfamiliar. Before he could process what he was seeing, young Thomas Shepherd Jr. looked up and spotted him on the stairs. Muller immediately retreated, claiming he had been confused by illness and was looking for the privy. The family's demeanor changed instantly from industrious focus to tense alertness. Reverend Shepherd guided Muller back to the sleeping quarters with an unsettling mixture of friendliness and veiled threat, explaining that the family had been processing a deer they had shot earlier that day and preferred to work at night when the temperature was cooler. The explanation seemed plausible enough, but something in Thomas Shepherd's eyes and the family's obvious tension convinced Muller that he had stumbled onto something dangerous. Muller left the aid station before dawn, claiming he needed to reach the next town quickly for business reasons. He rode through bitter cold for hours until he reached safety, and even then spent weeks debating whether to report what he had seen. After all, he had not actually witnessed any crime, just a family butchering what they claimed was a deer. But the memory of that smell, distinctly different from any animal he had ever butchered, haunted him until he finally decided to share his story with Sheriff McBride. McBride listened to Muller's account with growing conviction that his suspicions about the Shepherd family were correct. But he faced a significant problem. The Shepherd property was outside his direct jurisdiction, and more importantly, he had no concrete evidence of any crime beyond circumstantial observations and suspicious patterns. Reverend Shepherd was a respected member of the community, a man of God who had built genuine goodwill through years of apparently charitable work. Accusing him of murder based on incomplete evidence could destroy McBride's credibility and potentially allow a guilty man to escape if insufficient evidence led to acquittal. McBride needed something more, either a witness who could provide direct testimony or physical evidence that could not be explained away. He spent the next several weeks quietly investigating the Shepherd family's background, writing letters to churches in Pennsylvania and Ohio, where Thomas Shepherd claimed to have served as minister. The responses he received were troubling. While Shepherd had indeed been ordained and had served several congregations, his tenure at each church had ended under questionable circumstances. There were hints of financial irregularities, accusations of inappropriate conduct that had never been formally proven, and a pattern of sudden departures that left congregation members confused and suspicious. But the breakthrough McBride desperately needed came from the most unexpected source imaginable. On the morning of March 3, 1868, a tiny figure appeared at the sheriff's office door, shivering in the early spring cold and looking as though she might collapse at any moment. It was Lucy Shepherd, just 9 years old, who had walked nearly 15 miles through the night to reach town. Her dress was torn, her feet were bleeding through worn shoes, and her eyes held a depth of trauma that McBride had only seen in soldiers returning from the worst battles of the Civil War. Lucy's journey to the sheriff's office represented an act of courage almost impossible to comprehend for a child her age. She had finally reached a breaking point after witnessing her family murder a young couple with an infant child in late February. The sight of her mother calmly butchering the baby while humming a church hymn had shattered whatever psychological defenses Lucy had managed to construct around her family's activities. That night, after the family had gone to sleep, Lucy had stolen a small amount of food, put on her only coat, and fled into the darkness. The child was in such obvious distress that McBride initially struggled to understand her story. She spoke in fragments, jumping between events, sometimes becoming completely silent for long periods, occasionally breaking into sobs that shook her tiny frame. But gradually, over the course of several hours, with McBride's patient questioning and the help of his wife who had been summoned to comfort the traumatized child, Lucy's testimony emerged. What she described was so horrific that McBride's wife fled the room to be sick, and even the hardened former Philadelphia detective found himself struggling to maintain professional composure. Lucy provided details that no child could have invented, describing the layout of the basement processing area, explaining her family's routine when travelers arrived, naming victims she remembered, and revealing where her father kept his journal documenting the murders. She spoke about the sounds of people dying, the smell of the basement, and the crushing guilt she felt for not having stopped her family sooner. Most damning of all, she led McBride to the shed behind their property, where her father stored the special barrels of salt-cured meat waiting to be sold at market. McBride now had what he needed, an eyewitness willing to testify, and specific details that could be verified through a raid on the property. But he faced a terrible dilemma. Lucy was just a child, traumatized beyond measure, and putting her through the ordeal of public testimony would inflict further psychological damage on an already shattered young mind. Moreover, her testimony alone might not be enough to convict without physical evidence, and attempting a raid based solely on a child's claims risked allowing the Shepherds to destroy evidence or flee if the raid was unsuccessful. The sheriff spent 2 agonizing days weighing his options before finally deciding that he had moral and legal obligation to act immediately. The Shepherd family was actively killing people, and every day of delay potentially meant more victims. McBride assembled a posse of 6 trusted men, carefully chosen for their discretion, courage, and willingness to believe that a respected minister might actually be a serial killer. He did not reveal Lucy's identity as his informant, instead claiming to have received an anonymous tip that warranted investigation. The raid was planned for the early morning of March 6, 1868, when the family would likely be gathered for breakfast and less able to mount organized resistance. McBride and his men approached the property just after dawn, positioning themselves to cover all exits before announcing their presence. The sheriff's careful planning and his insistence on overwhelming force reflected his understanding that they were not confronting ordinary criminals, but a family that had spent years operating a sophisticated murder operation and would likely fight desperately rather than face justice. Reverend Thomas Shepherd answered the door with his usual welcoming smile, showing no obvious sign of concern at the presence of 7 armed men at his doorstep. He invited them in for coffee, asked about the purpose of their visit, and maintained an attitude of cooperative friendliness even as McBride explained that they had received reports of missing travelers and needed to search the property. Shepherd readily agreed, making a show of having nothing to hide, while his wife and children gathered in the main room watching with expressions that ranged from Thomas Jr.'s barely contained hostility to young Rebecca's obvious fear. The search began in the main house, with deputies methodically examining each room while Shepherd followed along, offering explanations for anything that seemed unusual. The house itself appeared relatively normal, if perhaps more prosperous than expected for a frontier minister's residence. Quality furniture, well-stocked pantries, and signs of comfortable living that reinforced Shepherd's story about grateful donations from travelers. But McBride was looking for something specific, the journal that Lucy had described, and he found it exactly where she had said it would be, hidden in a false bottom drawer in Thomas Shepherd's desk. The leather-bound book contained page after page of meticulous entries documenting 3 years of systematic murder. Names, dates, descriptions of victims and their possessions, notes about processing and sales. The evidence was so overwhelming and so carefully documented that even Shepherd's remarkable composure began to crack as he watched McBride read through the pages. The Reverend's face went pale, then flushed red, and finally settled into a mask of barely controlled rage. He began to speak, attempting to explain the journal as a record of travelers who had passed through his aid station, a desperate improvisation that crumbled under the weight of the explicit details recorded on every page. But the journal, damning as it was, represented only documentary evidence. McBride needed to see the basement, to verify Lucy's description and gather physical proof that would make conviction inevitable. When the sheriff announced his intention to search the basement, Thomas Shepherd's composure finally shattered completely. He lunged at McBride with surprising violence, attempting to grab the journal and destroy the evidence. Thomas Jr. and Samuel joined their father in attacking the deputies, while Martha Shepherd grabbed Rebecca and attempted to flee through the back door. The brief but intense struggle resulted in Thomas Shepherd being subdued and restrained, though not before he managed to land several solid blows that left McBride with a split lip and blackened eye. Thomas Jr. fought with the desperate fury of a young man who knew his life was over, requiring 3 deputies to finally wrestle him to the ground. Only Samuel, just 14 years old, surrendered after his initial resistance, breaking down into tears and claiming he had only followed his father's orders. Martha Shepherd was stopped before she could reach her horse, and Rebecca, just 16 years old and clearly terrified, immediately surrendered without resistance. With the family secured, McBride descended into the basement that Lucy had described in such traumatic detail. What he found there exceeded even his worst expectations based on Lucy's testimony. The processing area was exactly as she had described it, a fully equipped slaughterhouse designed specifically for processing human bodies. Fresh blood stains on the wooden tables indicated recent use. The hooks hanging from ceiling beams still bore fragments of rope where bodies had been suspended. The brick furnace in the corner contained ashes that, when later examined, would be found to include bone fragments. And most horrifying of all, hanging from the hooks in a meat storage area, were cuts of preserved meat in various stages of curing, some of which would later be confirmed through gruesome forensic examination to be of human origin. The deputies who descended into that basement with McBride were hardened frontiermen who had seen violence and death in many forms. But the organized industrial nature of the Shepherd family's killing operation affected them in ways that random violence never could. This was not crime of passion or desperation. This was calculated, systematic murder conducted with the cold efficiency of a business operation. The meticulous organization of the space, the specialized tools, the drainage system designed to facilitate cleanup, all testified to years of practice and refinement of technique. McBride ordered his men to secure the scene and prevent anyone from entering or leaving the property. He then spent several hours methodically documenting everything he found in the basement, taking detailed notes and sketches that would later be used as evidence in court. The sheriff's careful attention to proper evidence collection reflected his experience with Philadelphia police procedures, a level of investigative sophistication rare on the frontier and crucial for building an airtight case against the Shepherds. News of the arrests spread through the local community with shocking speed, creating reactions that ranged from utter disbelief to defensive anger, among those who had considered Reverend Shepherd a friend and spiritual advisor. Many community members initially refused to accept that a man who had conducted their church services, counseled their families, and presented such a convincing image of Christian charity could possibly be guilty of such monstrous crimes. Some accused McBride of fabricating evidence or extracting false confessions through torture, a defensive reaction rooted in the psychological impossibility of reconciling the monster with the man they thought they knew. But as evidence continued to emerge and details of Lucy's testimony became known, even the most skeptical community members were forced to confront the horrible truth. The discovery that many local families had been purchasing and consuming human flesh sold to them as pork created a wave of physical illness and psychological trauma that rippled through the entire region. People who had proudly served Shepherd's excellent pork to their families were devastated by the realization of what they had actually been eating. The violation went beyond the physical act of unwitting cannibalism to strike at the very foundation of community trust and social bonds. The Shepherd family was transported under heavy guard to Omaha, where they would be held pending trial. The journey required extraordinary security measures, as angry crowds gathered along the route, threatening to lynch the prisoners before they could reach formal justice. The depth of public rage reflected not just horror at the crimes themselves, but also a profound sense of betrayal. The Shepherds had not just murdered individuals, they had violated every principle of frontier community life: the trust in neighbors, the obligation to help travelers, the sanctity of Christian charity. They had turned the very institutions that made civilized life possible on the harsh frontier into instruments of systematic murder. Thomas Shepherd maintained an attitude of defiant self-righteousness throughout his imprisonment, claiming that he had been fulfilling a divine mission that mere mortals could not understand. He compared himself to Old Testament prophets who had carried out God's harsh judgments, and insisted that he had been testing travelers to determine their worthiness to enter the promised land of the West. His complete lack of remorse or recognition that he had done anything wrong demonstrated either profound mental illness or psychopathic personality structure that enabled him to rationalize any action through religious framework. Martha Shepherd adopted a different strategy, claiming that she had been a helpless victim of her husband's domination, forced to participate in crimes that horrified her. Her defense attorneys would later attempt to portray her as a battered wife who had no choice but to obey her husband's commands or face violence herself. But the evidence contradicted this narrative. Multiple witnesses testified to Martha's active and enthusiastic participation in the murders, her expertise in butchering and preserving human flesh, and her cheerful demeanor while conducting business with customers purchasing her products. The Martha Shepherd who had smiled while selling human meat, disguised as pork, bore little resemblance to the weeping, helpless victim she portrayed in court. The Shepherd children faced more complex legal and moral questions. Thomas Jr., at 18, was legally an adult and had clearly participated actively in the murders. But he had also spent his formative years under his father's total psychological domination, indoctrinated into a twisted theology before he was old enough to develop independent moral judgment. Samuel, at 14, and Rebecca, at 16, were even more clearly victims of their upbringing, raised in an environment where murder was presented as divine service and normal family activity. The question of how to balance justice for their participation in horrific crimes against recognition of their status as victims of child abuse would plague prosecutors, judges, and ethicists for years to come. The trial of the Shepherd family began in Omaha on June 15, 1868, and would become one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in American frontier history. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity every single day, with hundreds of people gathering outside hoping to catch a glimpse of the family that had turned Christian charity into systematic murder. Newspaper reporters from as far away as New York and San Francisco descended on Omaha, sending daily dispatches that horrified readers across the nation and transformed the Shepherd case into a national scandal that exposed the dark underbelly of westward expansion. The prosecution's case was built on three pillars of evidence that together created an overwhelming argument for guilt. First was the documentary evidence, Thomas Shepherd's own journal meticulously recording 3 years of murder with the precision of a business ledger. Second was the physical evidence from the basement, the tools, the drainage systems, the preserved meat that forensic examination confirmed was of human origin. And third, most powerful and most heartbreaking, was the testimony of Lucy Shepherd, the 9-year-old girl who had found the courage to expose her own family's monstrous crimes. Lucy's appearance on the witness stand became the emotional climax of the entire trial. The tiny girl, still showing visible signs of trauma and malnutrition from her ordeal, stood before a packed courtroom and described in a quiet, halting voice what she had witnessed over 3 years. She spoke about the night she first realized what her family was doing, about the sounds that came from the basement, about her mother teaching her older sister how to properly cure human flesh as casually as another mother might teach pie baking. She described the face of a young mother whose murder she had witnessed, the way the woman had pleaded for her baby's life even as Thomas Jr. dragged her toward the basement stairs. The courtroom sat in absolute silence as Lucy testified, many spectators openly weeping at the horror described by such an innocent voice. When the defense attorney attempted to cross-examine her, suggesting that she might be confused or mistaken about what she had seen, Lucy fixed him with a gaze far too old for her years and said simply, "I know what meat looks like, sir. I know what people look like when they're screaming. I know what my family did, and I know it was wrong even if my father said it was God's work." That single moment of testimony destroyed whatever slim hope the Shepherds might have had for acquittal. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts for Thomas, Martha, and Thomas Jr. on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The verdict for the younger children proved more complex. Samuel and Rebecca were found guilty of lesser charges that acknowledged their participation while recognizing their status as victims of extreme child abuse and psychological manipulation. Lucy, as the prosecution's star witness who had ultimately stopped her family's crimes, faced no charges whatsoever. The sentencing hearing brought the full weight of frontier justice down upon the Shepherd family. Judge Samuel Maxwell, a stern man who had presided over numerous murder trials during his career, delivered a scathing condemnation that went beyond mere legal judgment to address the moral dimension of the crimes. He spoke about the sacred trust that frontier communities placed in ministers and charitable institutions, about the particular evil of using religion as a mask for murder, and about the profound violation of every principle that made civilized society possible. Thomas Shepherd was sentenced to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for August 1, 1868. Martha Shepherd received the same sentence, making her one of the few women in American history to be executed for serial murder. Thomas Jr., despite his youth, was also sentenced to death, though significant public debate emerged about whether executing an 18-year-old who had been systematically indoctrinated by his father truly served justice. Samuel and Rebecca received lengthy prison sentences that would keep them incarcerated until their respective 21st birthdays, after which they would be released with new identities to protect them from public vengeance. The executions took place on a sweltering August morning before a crowd of over 2,000 spectators who had traveled from across Nebraska territory to witness justice being served. Thomas Shepherd went to the gallows still proclaiming his innocence and insisting that he had been following divine commands. Martha Shepherd maintained her claims of being a victim forced to participate against her will, though her appeals for clemency had been rejected by every authority up to the territorial governor. Thomas Jr. said nothing, walking to his death with the blank expression of someone whose psychological structure had completely collapsed under the weight of what he had done and what was being done to him. The physical deaths of the three principal killers did not end the Shepherd case's impact on the community and the nation. The psychological and social damage rippled outward in waves that would take years to fully manifest. Families who had unknowingly consumed human flesh struggled with profound psychological trauma. Many required medical treatment for symptoms that ranged from severe anxiety and depression to complete psychological breakdown. The violation went beyond the physical act to strike at fundamental assumptions about safety, trust, and the reliability of social institutions. The local community where the Shepherds had operated faced its own reckoning with how such monstrous crimes could have continued for years without detection. The uncomfortable truth was that many warning signs had been ignored or rationalized away because people desperately wanted to believe in the image that Reverend Shepherd presented. The case forced a painful examination of how charismatic authority figures could exploit trust, how religious devotion could blind people to obvious red flags, and how isolation and harsh conditions could create environments where normal social safeguards failed completely. Lucy Shepherd faced perhaps the most difficult path forward of anyone involved in the case. She had done the right thing, the heroic thing, by exposing her family's crimes and potentially saving dozens of future victims. But she was also a 9-year-old child who had lost her entire family, who carried crushing guilt for not having acted sooner, and who bore psychological scars that would never fully heal. She was placed with a foster family who had agreed to take her in despite the social stigma attached to anyone associated with the Shepherd name. They changed her identity, moved to a different territory, and tried to give her a chance at a normal life. Records suggest that Lucy survived into adulthood, married, and had children of her own, though she spent the rest of her life suffering from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She reportedly never spoke about her childhood to anyone outside of a small circle of trusted confidants, and her descendants only learned the truth about their ancestor decades after her death, when historical researchers traced her new identity. The psychological cost of doing the right thing, of being the single conscience in a family consumed by evil, was a burden that Lucy Shepherd carried until her dying day. The Shepherd case also had broader implications for how frontier communities approached the problem of criminal activity in isolated regions. The case demonstrated that even respected community leaders with impeccable credentials could be hiding monstrous secrets, and that religious authority provided no guarantee of moral behavior. Law enforcement agencies across the Western Territories began implementing better communication systems for tracking missing persons and establishing more regular patrols of remote areas where vulnerable travelers might be targeted. Perhaps most significantly, the Shepherd case contributed to changing attitudes about the myth of frontier virtue and the romanticized image of westward expansion. The comfortable narrative that portrayed Western settlers as uniformly heroic pioneers building civilization in the wilderness could no longer be sustained in the face of evidence that predators like the Shepherds had used the frontier's isolation and lack of oversight to commit crimes of stunning brutality. The West was not just a land of opportunity for honest settlers, it was also perfect hunting ground for monsters who understood how to exploit trust and desperation. Today, more than 150 years after the Shepherd family's crimes were exposed, the case continues to fascinate and horrify in equal measure. It represents one of the most extreme examples of how trusted institutions can become instruments of evil, how religious language can be perverted to justify the unjustifiable, and how entire families can be consumed by collective madness that transforms them into instruments of systematic murder. The Shepherd Aid Station, that building that once promised salvation but delivered damnation, was burned to the ground by angry locals shortly after the executions. Nothing remains of the physical structure, though the land itself is said to still bear a darkness that keeps it empty and unused even today. The case stands as a permanent warning about the dangers of blind trust, the importance of questioning authority, even when that authority presents itself in religious garments, and the critical need for vigilance in protecting the vulnerable from predators who understand exactly how to exploit desperation and faith. The 156 people who died at the Shepherd Aid Station, immigrants seeking nothing more than a chance at a better life, deserve to be remembered not just as victims but as reminders that evil often wears the most respectable faces and speaks in the most holy voices. What do you think about this chilling chapter of American history? The Shepherd family's crimes reveal how isolation, religious manipulation, and systematic exploitation can create conditions where unthinkable horrors become routine family activities. Could such systematic evil remain hidden today, or have we learned the lessons that cases like this tried to teach us? If this story has affected you as deeply as it should, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand that history's darkest chapters teach the most important lessons. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the disturbing truths that shaped America's past, and leave a comment telling me what other buried secrets you want us to investigate. The frontier held many more horrors than textbooks acknowledge, and we're committed to bringing them into the light where they can no longer hide. Thank you for having the courage to face this difficult story. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters are often those who convince us they're saints.